Vladimir Putin issued a direct warning to Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in June 2025. The warning was specific, unambiguous, and delivered through multiple channels to ensure there was no possibility of misunderstanding. Touch the Russian-operated nuclear power plants in Iran, Putin said, and face unpredictable consequences. That is not diplomatic language softened for public consumption. That is a threat, and it is a threat that fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict in ways that almost no one in Western media is explaining honestly. Let me be clear about what Putin actually said and why it matters. Russia operates commercial nuclear facilities in Iran. Russian technicians live and work at those sites. Russia supplies nuclear fuel for Iran's civilian energy program under agreements that predate this conflict by decades. And when the United States and Israel launched their strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure in June 2025, Putin went public with a warning that he had already delivered privately to Trump and Netanyahu. Do not strike facilities where Russian personnel are present. Do not damage infrastructure that Russia operates. And understand that if Russian citizens are harmed in your attacks, the consequences will be unpredictable. Unpredictable consequences. That phrase has a very specific meaning in the vocabulary of nuclear-armed state actors. It means the response will not be constrained by normal rules of proportionality. It means Russia reserves the right to respond in ways that escalate beyond the immediate theater of conflict. And it means that what started as a U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran now has the potential to become a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Having spent years inside military intelligence analyzing exactly these kinds of threat communications, I can tell you that Putin's warning was not a bluff. It was a red line drawn in the most explicit terms possible, short of an ultimatum. And the fact that this warning has been buried in Western coverage, mentioned briefly and then forgotten, tells you everything you need to know about how uncomfortable this reality is for the narrative that the conflict with Iran is a limited, manageable, regional operation. It is not limited. It is not manageable. And as of June 2025, it officially involves Russia in ways that create escalation pathways no one wants to acknowledge publicly. Now, let me walk you through exactly what Russian involvement in Iran's nuclear program looks like. Because understanding the infrastructure Putin was warning about is critical to understanding why his threat was credible and why it creates a strategic problem that the United States and Israel have no good way to solve. Russia built the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Bushehr is Iran's only operational nuclear power reactor, and it is a civilian facility designed to generate electricity. It went online in 2011 after decades of construction delays, and it operates under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, which means inspectors have access, and the reactor is not being used to produce weapons-grade material. Russia supplies the enriched uranium fuel for Bushehr, and Russian technicians are permanently stationed at the facility to maintain operations and provide technical support. That is not a secret arrangement. It is openly acknowledged by both Moscow and Tehran. Russia considers Bushehr a commercial project that demonstrates Russian nuclear technology and generates revenue through fuel supply contracts. Iran considers it a symbol of its right to peaceful nuclear energy and a demonstration that not all of its nuclear program is aimed at weapons development. When Israel and the United States began planning their strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, Bushehr presented a problem. Striking Bushehr would harm a civilian facility under international safeguards, which creates legal and diplomatic complications. But more importantly, striking Bushehr would kill or injure Russian citizens, which creates a direct confrontation with Moscow. Putin's warning made that confrontation explicit. He told Trump and Netanyahu that Russian personnel at Bushehr and at other facilities where Russia provides technical support are not acceptable targets. And he made clear that if those personnel are harmed, Russia will respond in ways that the United States and Israel may not anticipate. The United States and Israel did not strike Bushehr during the June 2025 war. That was not an accident. That was a deliberate decision to avoid crossing the red line Putin had drawn. And that decision tells you something critically important about the constraints that Russian involvement places on American and Israeli military options. But if you thought that was the end of the story, it is not. Because what Putin's warning actually revealed is that Russia has been deeply embedded in Iran's nuclear infrastructure for years. And that embedding creates leverage that Moscow can use to shape the conflict in ways that serve Russian interests. Let me explain what Russian leverage in Iran actually looks like and why it matters more than most analysts are willing to admit. Russia does not just operate Bushehr. Russia has been involved in Iran's civilian nuclear program for decades. Russian engineers helped design facilities, Russian companies supplied equipment, Russian technicians trained Iranian personnel. Moscow has detailed knowledge of what Iran has built, where it is located, and how vulnerable it is to attack. That knowledge is power. Russia uses it to position itself as the indispensable mediator in any negotiation over Iran's nuclear program. In February 2026, Russia offered to take Iran's enriched uranium, not destroy it, take it, transport it to Russia, where it would be stored under Russian control. That offer was a solution to the standoff over the 120 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that the United States and Israel demand be removed from Iranian territory. Think about what that offer actually means. Russia is saying that it can solve the uranium problem without the United States or Israel needing to conduct military operations to seize or destroy the material. Russia can take custody of the uranium, remove it from Iran, and eliminate the immediate threat of weaponization. That makes Russia the key to resolving the core issue that justified the entire military campaign. But it also makes Russia the gatekeeper. If uranium removal requires Russian cooperation, then the United States and Israel need Moscow's approval for any settlement that involves eliminating Iran's stockpile. And that gives Russia veto power over the terms of any long-term agreement. Russia is not offering this out of altruism. Russia offers it because it serves Russian strategic interests. Positioning Russia as the indispensable mediator enhances Russian influence in the Middle East. It creates dependency where both the United States and Iran need Russian involvement, and it gives Moscow leverage to extract concessions on Ukraine, sanctions relief, and U.S.-Russian relations. Putin is not defending Iran because of friendship. Putin defends Iran because Iran's survival serves Russian interests, and Iran's dependence on Russian support gives Moscow influence over a strategically critical country. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because what I am about to explain, why Russian involvement in Iran creates a strategic trap that the United States cannot escape without either accepting Russian terms or risking direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power is something that will not be discussed honestly in any mainstream outlet. Subscribe, because understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding where this conflict is actually heading. Let me walk you through the strategic trap that Russian involvement creates, because this is where the operational reality diverges sharply from the political messaging. The United States wants Iran's nuclear program eliminated or permanently constrained. Israel wants Iran's enrichment capacity destroyed and its uranium removed. Both want a settlement that ensures Iran cannot build nuclear weapons. But achieving that objective now requires either Russian cooperation or military action that risks killing Russian personnel. If the United States and Israel pursue military action to seize or destroy Iran's uranium without Russian cooperation, they cross the red line Putin drew. That creates a direct U.S.-Russia confrontation at a time when relations are already strained over Ukraine, arms control, and multiple other flashpoints. The risk of escalation is real, and the consequences of miscalculation are catastrophic. If the United States and Israel accept Russian mediation and allow Russia to take custody of Iran's uranium, they legitimize Russian involvement in a way that makes Moscow a permanent player in Middle Eastern security architecture. Russia gains influence, Russia gains leverage, and Russia establishes a precedent that future crises in the region cannot be resolved without Russian participation. Neither option is good. Both involve costs that American policymakers are reluctant to accept, and that is the trap. Russian involvement has transformed the Iran nuclear crisis from a problem the United States could theoretically solve through military force into a problem that requires negotiation with Moscow. And negotiation with Moscow means accepting Russian terms or walking away with the problem unresolved. Now, let me tell you what Russia is actually doing beyond the uranium offer, because the nuclear facilities are only part of the picture. Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence support, satellite data on U.S. warship locations, reconnaissance information on Israeli air operations, signals intelligence on American communications. Iran's foreign minister confirmed in March 2026 that military cooperation with Russia was good, which is diplomatic language for "we are receiving the support we need." Trump acknowledged in a Fox News interview that Russia might be helping Iran a bit, which is political language for "we know they are helping, but we do not want to escalate the confrontation by saying so explicitly." That intelligence sharing changes the tactical picture. Iran's ability to target U.S. warships in the Persian Gulf, to time missile strikes for maximum effect, to avoid Israeli air defenses, all of that improves significantly when backed by Russian satellite and reconnaissance capabilities. The United States has better satellites, but Russia has satellites that Iran can access. And in a conflict where Iran is operating under sustained pressure and degraded infrastructure, access to any external intelligence source is a force multiplier. Russia has also been signaling willingness to provide Iran with advanced military equipment. Putin said publicly in June 2025 that Russia had previously offered high-tech weapons to Iran, and that Tehran had, at that time, declined. But Putin left the door open for future sales by emphasizing Russia's ongoing support for Iran in all fields. That is diplomatic language for, if Iran asks, we are willing to provide. What kind of equipment is Russia talking about? Air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, electronic warfare platforms, the kinds of capabilities that would make future U.S. and Israeli operations significantly more costly and complicated. Russia has not delivered those systems yet, but the threat of delivery creates leverage. And the knowledge that Russia could provide them if the conflict escalates further forces the United States and Israel to factor Russian capabilities into their planning, even if those capabilities are not yet deployed. And then there is the China dimension. On June 19, 2025, while Israeli and Iranian forces were exchanging strikes, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a telephone summit specifically about the Iran conflict. That call was not a coincidence. It was coordination. China and Russia, the two great powers that have been pushing back against American dominance for years, were aligning their positions on Iran and signaling that both are prepared to support Tehran against U.S. and Israeli pressure. That alignment is not formal. There is no defense treaty that obligates China or Russia to intervene militarily if Iran is attacked. But there is a 2025 treaty between Russia and Iran that designates them as friendly states, and there are deepening economic and strategic ties between all three countries that create a loose coalition of interests opposed to American policy in the region. What that means operationally is that Iran is not isolated. Iran has great power backing, not unlimited backing, not unconditional backing, but enough backing to ensure that Iran can sustain a prolonged conflict, can access resources and intelligence that would otherwise be unavailable, and can resist U.S. and Israeli pressure in ways that a genuinely isolated state could not. Now, let me tell you what the most dangerous aspect of Russian involvement actually is, because it is not the intelligence sharing or the weapon sales or even the uranium offer. The most dangerous aspect is the escalation pathway that Russian personnel in Iran create. Every Russian technician working at Bushehr or at other facilities is a potential tripwire. If one of those technicians is killed or injured in a U.S. or Israeli strike, intentionally or accidentally, Russia has justification to respond. And the range of possible Russian responses is wide. Economic retaliation, cyber attacks, military support to Iran that goes beyond intelligence sharing, escalation in Ukraine or other theaters where Russian and American interests collide. Putin used the phrase unpredictable consequences specifically because he wanted to leave his options open and ensure that Trump and Netanyahu understood the risk of crossing that red line. The problem is that conflicts do not always respect red lines. Missiles miss their targets. Intelligence is incomplete. Decisions are made under pressure in fog of war conditions where the location of Russian personnel may not be fully known or may not be adequately communicated. The risk of an accidental strike on a facility with Russian personnel is real. And if that happens, Putin is in a position where he has publicly warned that consequences will follow, which means he has to follow through or lose credibility. That is the escalation dynamic that should terrify anyone paying attention. It is not that Putin wants a direct confrontation with the United States. It is that Putin has created conditions where an accident or miscalculation could force a confrontation neither side intended, but that both sides are now obligated to pursue because of commitments already made. Having been in rooms where these escalation scenarios are wargamed, I can tell you that the pathways from regional conflict to great power confrontation are shorter and more numerous than most people realize. And Russian involvement in Iran shortens those pathways even further. Let me tell you what happens if this trajectory continues, because the warning signs are clear, and the endpoint is not ambiguous. If the United States and Israel decide that eliminating Iran's nuclear capability requires striking facilities where Russian personnel are present, they have to make a choice. Accept the risk of killing Russians and deal with whatever Putin's response turns out to be, or avoid those facilities and leave Iran's nuclear program partially intact. Both options are bad. One risks direct confrontation with Russia. The other fails to achieve the stated objective of the military campaign. If Russia decides that its interests in Iran are important enough to provide advanced weapons or direct military support, the conflict transforms from a U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran into something that involves Russian forces or Russian-supplied systems that significantly complicate American and Israeli operations. That escalates the cost and the risk of continuing the war. If Iran, emboldened by Russian backing and frustrated by the failure of diplomatic efforts, decides to escalate in ways that directly threaten Russian equities, Moscow faces a choice between supporting an ally whose actions are creating risks Russia does not want, or distancing itself from Iran and losing the influence it has spent years cultivating. That dynamic introduces unpredictability into Russian decision-making that makes the conflict harder to manage. And if an accident happens, if a U.S. or Israeli strike kills Russian personnel, despite efforts to avoid them, the question is not whether Putin responds, but how Putin responds. And the how is what makes this so dangerous, because Putin has deliberately left that ambiguous to maximize his leverage and ensure that Trump and Netanyahu understand the stakes of crossing the line. Putin's warning in June 2025 was not a one-time statement. It was the establishment of a framework that continues to shape the conflict. Russian personnel remain in Iran. Russian involvement in Iran's nuclear sector continues, and the red line Putin drew remains in place, creating a constraint on U.S. and Israeli military options that did not exist before the warning was issued. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, you understand that Russian involvement in Iran is not a footnote. It is a fundamental dimension of the conflict that changes the strategic calculus for every actor involved. You understand that Putin's warning was not bluster. It was a credible threat backed by Russia's willingness to defend its personnel and its interests. And you understand that the presence of Russian technicians at Iranian nuclear facilities creates an escalation tripwire that could transform a regional conflict into a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because Russian involvement in Iran is only going to become more important as this conflict continues. The uranium is still there. The facilities are still operating. Russian personnel are still on the ground, and the warning Putin issued still stands. Pay attention, subscribe, share, because the next phase of this conflict will be shaped as much by what Russia does as by what the United States and Israel decide. And understanding that reality is essential to understanding where this is actually heading.